I'm John Finley for the Baptist History and Heritage Society. Today we're on the campus of Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, for the first in a series of video presentations on Baptist identity entitled Hopeful Apocalypse, Charting a Baptist Future. But before we get to the Baptist history, it's important for us to consider some of the significant ways American Christianity has changed in recent years, as well as certain trends in both Baptist and North American culture. Our presenter today is Dr. Bill Leonard, founding dean and emeritus professor of Wake Forest University's School of Divinity. At the end of this video, you'll find a discussion guide to aid in further discussions in your congregation or classroom. And now, here is Dr. Bill Leonard.
Today we want to talk about what I've called a hopeful apocalypse, charting a Christian future with a Baptist case study in this. And we really begin with a variety of questions that shape where we're going. And that is, what does the changing sociology of Sunday mean for the church of the 21st century? And we want to revisit that question because I think one of the major demographic realities of the 21st century church is the changing sociology of Sunday. Second, how do 21st century Baptists and Christians in general make a case for a believer's church? But particularly with Baptists, what does the idea of a believer's church mean to Baptists in the 21st century? Third, why are Americans distancing themselves from churches in significant numbers? And with that, how are religious experiences articulated and passed on to new generations? And finally, can Protestants make a gospel case without requiring culture privilege? With that in mind, we'll begin with what I think is one of the most amazing statements that Baptists ever wrote. It comes from what is called the English Declaration from Amsterdam, Baptists beginning in Amsterdam around 1609, and on their way back to England, they were English exiles, they write a brief confession of faith called the English Declaration in 1611. And this is how they defined the church. The Church of Christ is a company of faithful people separated from the world by the Word and the Spirit of God, being knit together unto the Lord and to one another by baptism upon their own confession of faith and sins. I think that's a wonderful one-sentence definition of the nature of the Baptist tradition and the church with Baptists. But we began really by looking at the situation in America, the American and the Baptist context, both in terms of legacy and transition. And we say American Christianity began with an immigrant people. People came here primarily from Europe, but later from elsewhere, from Africa, in forced immigration, for example, and later from South America. So everybody was an immigrant. But once they got here, they had what we could call a welcoming nativism, meaning they wanted everybody to be here, but once you got here, they didn't necessarily want you. Defining what an American was, depending on who was in power and who was defining the nature of the American society. And so they wanted you, but they didn't if you were from the wrong race or class or country. So throughout American history, there's this push-pull, meaning that America gives freedom and then finds ways to take it away. And so religious liberty was ultimately, not originally, but ultimately became normative through the First Amendment. But consistently in American history, the society and the religious communities have granted religious freedom grudgingly. Often it took a while for a new religious group or a group that seemed outside the, quote, norm to receive religious liberty in a serious way. And I'm just going to run a list of that just quickly to walk through my examples. Colonial Baptists exiled and jailed in the 1640s in Massachusetts and in Virginia. Colonial Quakers exiled and executed. Mary Dyer, the Quaker preacher, hanged in Boston in 1660. Mother Ann Lee, the founder of the Shakers, attacked by mobs as a British spy, and because of the injuries she received over time, dying early in 1784. Joseph Smith, the Mormon, shot by an anti-Mormon mob, June 1844 in Carthage, Illinois. Bloody Monday, August 6, 1855, Louisville, Kentucky. Anti-Catholic mobs attacked German, Italian immigrants to keep them from voting. 22 people killed. Downtown Louisville today. The Minersville School District versus Gobitis, 1940. The Supreme Court ruled that public schools could compel Jehovah's Witnesses to say the pledge to the flag under essentially court order. I have a 90-year-old former Jehovah's Witness friend who, as an elementary school student in Massachusetts, was expelled from school because he wouldn't say the pledge to the flag as a Jehovah's Witness. The KKK bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, Birmingham, September 15, 1963, 4 little girls killed. The Sikh Temple, Oak Creek, Wisconsin, 6 killed, August 5, 2012. June 17, 2015, Mother Emanuel AME Church, Charleston, South Carolina, 9 church members gunned down. November 5, 2017, First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, Texas, 27 people killed. The largest number of people in a mass shooting in Texas, I think the second largest group in American history in general, in mass killings. October 27, 2018, Tree of Life Synagogue, Pittsburgh, 11 killed. April 27, 2019, Shabbat of Poway Synagogue, Poway, California, 2 killed. April 2019, 3 Louisiana African American churches burned. And the list goes on since 2019, as you'd probably know. So religious freedom is granted grudgingly. And then there was the question of what in the early days was called American chosenness. America as God's new Israel, as Redeemer nation, as holy experiment, H-O-L-Y. We call that today American exceptionalism, America as elect nation. But then the question, who's in the elect? Which group is inside and which side is out? Which side is outside on the in this chosen nation? Denominational commitments developed very quickly, really imported from England in the 1600s, but inside those denominations and outside, sectarian divisions became increasingly normative, and often the sectarian groups or new religions or new religious groups were kept outside the norm until they either won their place in the society or the law intervened. And then religious experience. Protestants were both nurturing individuals, rearing people from infant baptism through confirmation in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and they entered the church through that kind of nurture, or with the required conversion experience in the believers' church movement, such as the Mennonites and the Baptists. The methodology for that was, for a period of time, revivals and awakenings, and the difference between Christian nurture and dramatic conversion events. So multiple ways of entering into religious experience. And then churches affirming biblical authority. But then you have to ask, whose interpretation? I find it very interesting that there are sometimes people, Baptists included, who want to call themselves Bible-believing Christians, as if the rest of the church wasn't. No, all churches are Bible-believing. They just don't believe it in the same way. And we have to be careful with terminology. And then underneath all of that was, from the beginning, Protestant privilege made Protestantism a special and favored religious expression in American culture. And just a mere survey of Christian history reflects that in this country. And with that, Protestant privilege meant that Sunday was a privileged day. Blue laws kept people from shopping until church was over. The society itself, often sports events were scheduled after 11 o'clock, that holy hour, when God finds his way into America. The sociology of Sunday was privileged for Christians in general and Protestants in particular. That's all changed, and we'll talk about that. And then in terms of theology and doctrine, there were always conflicting orthodoxies. And so we ask, what are the biblical hermeneutics of religious experience? That is, how do churches, using Scripture admonitions, talk about religious experience, and why are so few Americans statistically listening? So let's look at the stats for some of this. Right now, and these are always changing, mainline churches stand at about 14% of the population. They're up about 1% in the latest study from last year. Evangelicals generally peaked in the 1990s at about 29% of the population. In 2019, they now stand at about 22.5%. This is based on a general social survey of 2019. Roman Catholics, the largest single religious group in the country, some 65 to 67 million, are at about 23%. And there are some studies that say if you just counted Anglo-Catholics, white Catholics, the decline in Catholic life would be catastrophic. And then there are the nones or the nuns. These are folks who, in survey after survey, identify themselves as having no religious affiliation, no discernible religious affiliation. In surveys throughout the 20th century, they were about 7%, 8% of the population in studies. In the 2000s, they have increased at least 1% or more every year, so that in 2019, it's suggested that they are at about 23.1%. So look, if you think about it, evangelicals, Roman Catholics, and nones are all at about the same statistical level in the country in 2019. And so we can say that increasingly in American life, 1 in 5 Americans considers himself, herself, a non. But if you look at millennials, 18 to 30, that would be 1 in 3. Increasingly, Baptist demographics of decline look more mainline than they do evangelical, meaning a steady decline that mirrors the declines that have taken place in the mainline denominations. In 2014, the Pew Research Center did a study of just millennials, and the list, this is taken from their own document. Millennials are relatively unattached to organized politics and religion. They are linked by social media. They are burdened by debt, especially education. They are distrustful of people and institutions. They are in no rush to marry. They are optimistic, nonetheless, about the future. And they are the most racially diverse generation. 43% are non-white, and that will become a majority no later than 2043. Another recent study I have seen in 2019, 2020, is that 80% of senior Americans are white and Christian. 29% of young adult Americans are white and Christian. So that bears up with this racially diverse generation. So the culture trends that are around us, I'll just run through them rather quickly. Denominational systems are disconnecting, disengaging, and debating. There are fewer individuals who think of their religious identity or Christian identity in terms of a denominational identity. There are some, depending on the count, and it varies, somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 American churches close their doors every year. Non-denominational fellowships and megachurches are new models for church life, but statistically, the megachurches only represent about 8% of the population. And non-affiliation increases every year. This is often persons who call themselves spiritual but not religious, or believers but not belongers. So the declines in the public square of persons attending churches mean that the nurturing churches, infant baptism and confirmation, are declining because they are dependent on families bringing their children to church. Fewer families, fewer children, fewer church members. The evangelical churches, the conversionist churches, are depending on persons responding to their call to conversion. And as fewer people do that, then fewer people are being saved, at least publicly, within the traditions of the church. With that, then, Sunday schools are declining very quickly across the spectrum. And so are budgets, church membership, and baptisms. Some pastors I know speak of this generation as evidencing the death of the tithing generation in congregations. In many ways, Protestants in general, I keep repeating this because it's very essential, are often saying that they are being persecuted when the real issue is that their culture privilege may be declining. And they see that as some sort of persecution of Christians. So what do we do about that? I think in many ways we have to talk about strategies for the future, and this would be my list with you. One, congregations must redefine their own identity. In the past, quite often, denominations defined congregational identity. The denomination, through its literature, through its programs, through its traditions, helped local churches say what it meant to be Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopal, etc. As denominations either decline or become have fewer resources for doing that, and as people move in and out of denominational affiliation, it falls upon congregations in their locales and with their membership to say who they are and what they believe. And so congregational identity is important. I call that a foundation of hospitable traditionalism. That is, congregations saying, who are we as a biblical people, as a historical people, as a viable Christian tradition? That's why do we baptize? Why do we take the Lord's Supper or not? Defining what it means to be Christian in terms of biblical, sacramental, or identity characteristics. But that should be hospitable, meaning that traditionalism should turn them outward on the world, not inward on themselves. And thus congregations have to come to terms with their own localism, meaning each congregation has to explore the sociology of its community in order to know how to best respond to the needs of that community. And congregations can no longer take it for granted that the people who show up on Sundays know why the congregation does what it does. You can't expect that they know for Baptists why that pool of water sits behind the choir. You can't suppose that they understand why and how you take those little shot glasses of temperance grape juice and little pieces of bread that some of my former colleagues used to call Baptist chiclets. You don't know, they may not know why you're doing that. So the sermon, in many ways, on Communion and Baptism Sunday has to say, at least in part, what those sacraments mean, because the people who come, even some of the regular folks, may not know why you're doing what you're doing. And in that, congregations reclaim rituals. And then congregations have to come to terms with the sociology of Sunday, the changing sociology. People ask me, what do you mean by the changing sociology of Sunday? I can give you one word definition: soccer. And when you say that, everybody knows, because the people who either leave the church early or don't show up at all to get their kids to Sunday soccer is just a small illustration of that. Sunday is now being asked to carry the burden of many more things than it used to. Not just for people who are laying out of church, but for people who have other demands made upon them in terms of family, in terms of jobs, in terms of things they didn't get done during the week that they want to get, that they need to get, they must get done on a Sunday. And so supposing that Sunday is traditionally what it used to be is to miss the point of the changing sociology of Sunday. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges to congregations as well. And this is a very important point for me, the congregations that I see responding to these demographic, cultural, and theological changes are the churches that have begun to develop what I would call signature ministries. Meaning they don't start by asking, is our church growing numerically? That's sudden death. They ask, is our church thriving spiritually? That is, have we found gospel imperatives that challenge members of the congregation to become energized and engaged in ministry in the church and in the world? And those churches that are thriving with those kinds of ministries may be the ones that wind up growing numerically, but you don't start with the numerical growth question because then you'll start blaming each other or the culture. And congregations must, in the 21st century, in ways they may not have done before, confront issues of theology and praxis relative to race and gender, sexuality, and both ecumenical, that is, relationships with other Christian groups, and interfaith relationships, relationships with non-Christian groups that occupy space and ministry in a particular community. And this, I think, is where we sort of wind up. That is, congregations and individuals must revisit and retell the Jesus story. And retelling the Jesus story means that congregations may need to affirm and develop strategies for a new or a revised spirituality. How do you tell people not simply to be saved, but how do you tell them how to experience spiritual responsibility and nurture in community and with themselves? And in retelling the Jesus story, even on Sunday morning, we can no longer take it for granted that people know that story. And so we may have to we may have to not try to take the details of the Jesus story for granted, or that in preaching or in teaching or in just being together, we use phrases that are common to traditional Christians, but that people who are showing up in church don't know what they mean. Who's the prodigal son? Who's the woman at the well? Those kinds of basic references that if you've been to Sunday school, you may know, but if you haven't been to Sunday school or been to a lot of church services, you don't know what that means. It's another language altogether. And my suggestion for congregations, and it's just a suggestion, particularly for Baptist conversionist believers' church traditions, let's not start with Nicodemus and being born again. People can't get to that right now because the old ways of doing that in terms of revivals or awakenings or evangelical campaigns just aren't there. Why not start with Jesus by the lake shore? The one that shows up in the backside of Galilee, and the people who hear him don't know what in the world he's doing and who he is, but they leave their nets and follow him. And with no idea, if they knew where it was going to take them, they probably wouldn't have done it. But he draws them out by the things he is saying. And what's the most important thing that Jesus says by the lakeshore? This is Matthew 10 and Luke 10. When you go, don't take purse, don't take shoes, don't go to McDonald's for a Happy Meal. Just go. And if you don't have time to tell them everything, tell them this. The kingdom of heaven, let's say God's new day, kingdom of heaven, God's new day, has come near you. That's Jesus' first message. It's not about believe in me. It's not about follow the rules I'm setting for you. It's the kingdom of heaven, God's new day, has come near you. Live like that's happening and find out what that means. I think that's a way you start retelling the Jesus story. And again, my friend Tony Campolo does this so well when he tells us that the churches of the Reformation read Jesus through the Apostle Paul, but that postmodern churches, 21st century churches, have to relearn how to read St. Paul through Jesus. And I think that's an important guide. Also, we can't expect people to come to us. We have to find ways to go to them. Young families are not under the social or the familial or the cultural pressure to go to church. So the church has to find a way to enter community with ministries and gospel and care and mentoring that will draw people to the community of the church, not to the programs first, but to the church as a community that offers help in the opioid crisis for young people, for families, for people struggling with their own financial and personal struggles. Can the church provide a response to them? You don't need to come in order to respond to us. We're doing gospel triage with you. And then, particularly, providing Jesus' response, so much a part of his ministry, to the people on the margins. And that's not just the people who are homeless, though it is. It's not just the people who are hungry, though it is. It's the families that may, in ways we don't even know, feel or be on the margins themselves in terms of personal struggles and familial issues that no one knows about. And I continue to think this wonderful watchword is that churches need to consider themselves and their members as agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion. That's a starting point for defining what it means to be a part of the nature of the church. And thinking about those interpretations of what it means to be church is, in the 21st century, what those 17th century Baptists perceived as they started a new movement, responding to the marginalized and calling people to faith in Christ. And then with that, let's enhance people's lives by learning how to talk about and reclaim symbol and sacrament, the Word of God without words, awe and mystery, the God whose ways are past finding out, and contemplation and reflection, the God who comes to us in ways we never expected. The transcendence of the God who is beyond us, and the immanence of the God who is with us. And I've been going back in thinking about this and to thinking about the Jesus story to Albert Schweitzer's wonderful paragraph from his monumental study, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And this is what he says. He comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old by the lakeside. He came as he came to those who knew him not. He speaks to us the same words, to us, follow thou me, and sets us to the tasks which he has to fulfill in our time. He commands. And to those who obey him, whether they be wise or simple, he will reveal himself in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings, which they shall pass through in his fellowship. And as an inexplicable mystery, they shall learn in their own experience who he is. The Jesus story, retelling it for a new day, a new time, and a crisis situation in the American Christian churches. Thank you. I'll give you an example. Myers Park Baptist Church in Charlotte several years ago realized that fewer people were coming to Sunday school, in part because that time of 9 o'clock or whenever on Sunday was not something they could get to. So they reorganized their membership around small groups. And they started giving churches options for when they could meet to be together and talk or discuss theology or study Scripture. And they found that young couples, families with children, still wanted to come to Sunday school because they had childcare and because they wanted their children to have that experience as well. But they found that singles and older families often didn't have that window for whatever reason. And so they often had weekly meetings in restaurants. They had what they call theology on tap, TAP. I'll let you discern that. And they also had public occasions where people met in parks and markets. And so they gave as many options for small group experience and teaching as they possibly could. Because this urban congregation needed those kinds of options if they were going to be able to participate at all. Well, and this is often hard for Baptists who and other certain groups that depended on the tithe, but many churches have rented out space in their facilities that were being vacant all week, and some do that gratis because they can afford to do that, but others have provided, I would say, minimal rent to community agencies. Some have had schools that used a part of their building, and that became an income. Also, some have had the little church where I was pastor for 4 years in Massachusetts. It's a very small congregation. They have suppers and bake sales and those kinds of things throughout the year in their relatively small town with a city square that helps add to the funds they have, because many of their members simply can't, in their view, afford to tithe. So they have to find other community ways of both making themselves known and securing income. And some, I think, have also found themselves, in many ways, sadly, having to cut staff or to go with bivocational staff and pastor, at least to get them through some of the more pressing needs financially that are around them. But again, looking for options that can be financially beneficial can be very helpful.